James Walker sat behind the wheel of his black Lincoln MKZ, gliding down the quiet road. It had been a long, tiring day, filled with endless paperwork and meetings. But tonight was different. Tonight, he was headed to the home of Mayor Richard Davis, a friend and ally in his years with the FBI. The mayor had invited him for a private dinner at his mansion, a rare occasion for James, who wasn't much of a socialite. As he neared the turnoff for the mayor's estate, a flashing red and blue light appeared in his rearview mirror. The sound of a siren followed, and James frowned. He hadn't broken any laws, so why was he being pulled over? He signaled and eased the car to the side of the road, rolling down his window slightly, waiting for the officer to approach. A young officer in his early 30s stepped out of the patrol car. He was tall, well-built, with a hard expression on his face. No greeting, just a command. "License and registration," the officer said curtly. James remained calm. "May I ask why I've been stopped?" "The plate's from out of town. I need to check unfamiliar vehicles," the officer replied with a sharp tone, his eyes scanning James's car as if searching for something suspicious. James frowned. "My car is registered, and I haven't broken any traffic laws. This is unnecessary." The officer didn't respond, but crossed his arms and fixed James with a challenging glare. "Just hand over your papers, now." James's patience was running thin. "I'm sorry, officer, but I don't see a valid reason for this stop." The officer's gaze darkened, his body language turning more aggressive. "I said give me your papers," he repeated, his tone now laced with impatience. James could sense the tension in the air. The officer wasn't acting like someone doing their job. There was something more to this. "I'm not giving you my papers unless you tell me why I've been stopped," James said, his voice even but firm. The officer's expression turned colder. He took a step closer, his eyes filled with contempt. "You think you can question me? Just because you're FBI? You're still just another black man on these streets?" The words hit harder than James expected. He had faced racism before, but this officer's blatant hostility was different. This wasn't just an unfortunate interaction. It was a reflection of deep prejudice. James's pulse quickened, but he held himself steady. "You have no right to talk to me like that. I've done nothing wrong." The officer, whose badge read Mike Johnson, sneered. "Oh, I know exactly who you are. You think your badge means anything out here? Not when you're on my turf. Now hand over your papers, or I'll make you." James kept his composure, his voice low but unwavering. "You're making a mistake, and I won't let you intimidate me into submission." Mike Johnson's face flushed with anger. "You think I'm intimidated by you, huh?" He stepped even closer, his fist clenched at his side. "I'm in charge here." "I'm telling you to stop," James warned. "Your actions are crossing a line, and you're going to regret this." Before James could say more, Officer Johnson's face twisted with rage. "Get out of the car," he barked louder than before. "Now!" James was caught off guard. He hadn't done anything to warrant being forced out of the car, but his instincts kicked in. He needed to handle this carefully. "No," James replied, his tone even. "I'm not getting out. I haven't broken any laws." Johnson's anger reached its peak. He pulled his gun from its holster and aimed it at James, his voice trembling with fury. "Get out of the car or I'll make you." The tension in the air was thick. James felt his heart rate spike, but he remained calm. Slowly, he opened the door, raising his hands to show he wasn't resisting. "I'm getting out, but don't make this worse." Johnson didn't lower his weapon. He barked, "Kneel! Now!" James could feel the weight of the officer's anger, but he knew better than to argue. He slowly knelt down, keeping his eyes fixed on the officer. He could sense the escalating danger. "I'm telling you, you're making a mistake," James said, his voice low and steady. Johnson sneered. "Mistake? The only mistake is letting people like you walk around here." James gritted his teeth, but he knew he couldn't let this go any further. The officer was about to escalate, and he needed to get out of this alive. James could feel the cold concrete beneath his knees, but his mind was elsewhere. The officer's gun was still pointed directly at him, the barrel steady as a warning. It felt as though time had slowed, the quiet night air amplifying every breath, every heartbeat. The officer, Mike Johnson, was clearly out of control, but James knew that any wrong move could end in disaster. Johnson's voice broke the silence. his words thick with disdain. "Stay down. Don't move. You're lucky I don't shoot you where you kneel." The words stung, but James kept his composure. He knew he had to remain calm despite the danger closing in on him. Every part of his training as an FBI agent screamed at him to act, to defend himself, but he knew he had to wait for the right moment. From where he knelt, James could see the red and blue lights flashing on the officer's patrol car. The police radio crackled in the background, but it felt so far away, like a different world from the one he was trapped in. He hadn't expected a routine stop to spiral into this kind of situation, especially not with an officer so blatantly hostile. "Why are you doing this?" James said softly, trying to appeal to whatever sense of reason Mike might have had left. "What did I do to deserve this?" Johnson didn't answer immediately, his face twisted with anger, his hands shaking slightly on the gun's handle. "You people think you can just waltz around like you own the place. I don't care who you are. You're nothing but trouble." James's gut churned. This was no longer about a traffic stop. This was about something much deeper: the officer's racism, his abuse of power, and the dangerous consequences that came with it. Johnson wasn't just angry. He was filled with something darker, prejudice that had clouded his judgment. "Officer," James said, his voice steady but firm, "you're making a huge mistake. There are consequences for what you're doing." For a moment, the officer hesitated, his eyes narrowing. He looked down at James as if weighing his options. The gun trembled slightly in his hand, and for a brief second, James thought he might be able to de-escalate the situation. But then the officer's lips curled into a sneer. "Don't lecture me. You're nothing but a thug in a suit. I told you to stay down. Don't make me repeat myself." The last of James's patience snapped. He was done trying to reason with a man whose mind was already made up. "I'm not a criminal," James said, his voice growing colder, more resolute, "and I won't be treated like one." The officer's expression hardened at the defiance in James's tone. "You're gonna regret that." Johnson took a step back, his hand moving slowly to his sidearm. The gleam of metal caught the streetlights as he pulled the gun out and pointed directly at James's chest. Everything slowed down again. James's instincts screamed at him to move, to protect himself, but he kept his hands raised, his posture calm, as if the officer's threats didn't faze him. Inside, his heart raced. He had been in situations like this before, dangerous situations where things could end in violence, but never like this. Never with an officer who had so clearly crossed the line. Johnson's breath quickened as he pointed the gun. "I'm telling you for the last time, get on your feet. Now!" James didn't move. He couldn't. Not unless the officer forced him. If he moved too quickly, it would give the officer an excuse. If he stayed too still, it could get worse. "Okay," James said, his voice level, not giving any indication of fear. "I'll get up, but you need to lower the gun." For a long moment, Johnson didn't respond, his grip tightening around the weapon. James could see the officer's pulse throbbing in his neck. He was shaking now, his face twisted in rage. But James held his ground. He had done nothing wrong. This wasn't just about the officer trying to assert his power. It was about something much deeper and more dangerous. With slow, measured movements, James opened the door of the car and stepped out, keeping his hands where the officer could see them. His leg, though, was aching from the cold ground, but he didn't show it. "I'm out of the car," James said calmly, still standing with his hands up. "But you need to listen to me. This can end without anyone getting hurt." Johnson's eyes flickered with something like doubt, but it was quickly replaced with contempt. "Kneel, now." Without thinking, the officer stepped forward, the gun still trained on James. It felt like a sickeningly familiar moment, a moment where the balance of power had tipped too far, and James knew he wasn't going to make it out without getting hurt. "I'm telling you, I won't kneel for anyone who doesn't respect me as a person," James said, his voice low and authoritative. "But if you want to make me, go ahead." Johnson was too far gone now. His eyes narrowed into dangerous slits, and his finger tightened around the trigger. He was no longer reasoning with James. He was simply acting on his fury, and it was all about to explode. The air between them felt charged, thick with tension. James knew things had gone too far. The officer was no longer pretending to follow protocol. This was pure aggression. He could see the hatred behind Johnson's eyes, the way his finger hovered over the trigger like it was just a matter of time before he'd pull it. Everything in James's FBI training screamed at him to react, to disarm the situation before it escalated any further. But what could he do? He was kneeling on the cold concrete, hands up, his mind racing as his heartbeat pounded in his ears. Every second felt like an eternity. "Listen to me, officer," James said, his voice steady but firm. "You don't have to do this. This doesn't have to end in violence." But Johnson didn't listen. The officer's breathing had become erratic, his hands shaking. The gun wavered in the air, as though Johnson couldn't make up his mind on whether to pull the trigger or not. James's gaze locked on the officer's hand, watching the subtle movement of his finger. He wasn't afraid. He couldn't afford to be afraid. Fear would cloud his judgment, and he needed clarity. Suddenly, the officer's eyes flared with fury, and James knew it was over. There was no going back. Johnson snapped his finger back, and the sound of a gunshot ripped through the night, a sharp crack that echoed down the empty street. Pain exploded in James's left leg, and his body hit the ground with a sickening thud. His mind went blank for a moment, disoriented from the shock of it. He gasped for air, his hand instinctively moving to his leg, where the warm blood was quickly pooling on the pavement. The pain was unbearable, sharp and burning, and James could barely stay conscious. "James!" he heard someone shout, Mayor Harrison's voice. It felt distant, muffled by the ringing in his ears, but the words carried with them a weight of urgency. He forced himself to focus. He had to stay conscious. He had to make sure the situation didn't get worse. Through the fog of pain, James reached for his phone. His fingers were slick with blood, but he gritted his teeth and pulled it from his jacket pocket, dialing the one number that would bring the whole situation crashing down. "William," James managed to rasp, his voice weak but steady, despite the blood dripping from his leg. "It's James. I've been shot. I need you. Now." The phone line went silent for a moment, but then Mayor Harrison's voice crackled back through the speaker, filled with panic. "Where are you? I'll get there. I'll get there right now. Just hang in there." James didn't reply. His vision was fading, his breath shallow, but he was determined to hold on until help arrived. He couldn't let this moment, this violation of everything he stood for, be the end of it. He needed to ensure the officer was held accountable. Behind him, Officer Johnson stood frozen, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and fear. He hadn't expected this. He had pulled the trigger out of anger, out of prejudice. But now, standing there watching the man he had just shot, a real fear started to sink in. It was too late to take back the bullet, too late to undo what had been done. The minutes dragged on, but to James it felt like hours. His breath came in ragged gasps, the blood from his wounds soaking into his clothes and the pavement beneath him. The pain in his leg was blinding, but his focus remained sharp. He could hear the sirens in the distance, the unmistakable sound of law enforcement closing in. But he had no way of knowing if it was enough to stop this madness in time. He could barely hear the sound of footsteps approaching from behind, but he could make out the shape of Mayor Harrison emerging from the shadows. The mayor's face was pale, his expression one of complete disbelief as he looked down at James. "Oh God, James, stay with me! Stay with me!" Mayor Harrison said, rushing to his side. James nodded, though the pain made it hard to do anything more than breathe. His vision was starting to blur, the world tilting at the edges as he struggled to stay conscious. He could feel the mayor's hand on his shoulder, the urgency in his voice, but it felt like it was all happening from a distance. "Help's coming. You're going to be okay," Harrison continued, though the doubt in his voice made it clear he wasn't entirely sure. Johnson, still standing motionless by his patrol car, looked from the mayor to James, his face a twisted mask of guilt and fear. I didn't mean to. You shot him, you fool!" Mayor Harrison roared, his voice trembling with rage. He turned back to James, his hands pressing down on the wound to try to stop the bleeding. "Don't worry, James. Help's on the way." But even as he said it, there was a cold, sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach. This was no ordinary police misconduct. This was a man in a position of power, a man who was supposed to protect and serve, who had used his authority to hurt another person, a federal agent no less. And now there would be consequences. The scene on Forest Lane became a whirlwind of flashing lights and frantic voices. The mayor and the police chief arrived in their cars, followed by a convoy of patrol vehicles, as James's blood continued to seep into the cold concrete beneath him. Officers rushed to the scene, their eyes scanning the area, trying to make sense of what had just transpired. But there was no mistaking it. The situation was far beyond a simple traffic stop gone wrong. Mayor Harrison dropped to his knees beside James, his face filled with a mixture of anger and concern. He had been a friend to James for years, had worked alongside him on countless cases, fighting for justice. But this was something different. This was an abuse of power, and it had almost cost James his life. "James, hang in there. We're going to get you out of here," Harrison said, his voice cracking with emotion. He looked up at the officers who had followed him. "Get an ambulance now!" As the paramedics arrived, the officers began securing the area. Johnson, still standing near his patrol car, was visibly shaking. He hadn't moved since the shooting, his gun still in his hand, though he wasn't pointing it at anyone anymore. His wide eyes flickered between James, the mayor, and the other officers who had gathered around. The reality of what he had done was starting to sink in. He had pulled the trigger, he had shot an FBI agent, a man he had no reason to harm. His racist assumptions had clouded his judgment, and now there would be consequences. "Bradley," the police chief, David Cole, called out, his voice sharp and commanding. "Get over here." Johnson stumbled forward, his face pale as he stepped toward the group, his body stiff with guilt. Mayor Harrison's eyes bore into him, full of fury and disbelief. "You are done. You are suspended. Now," Cole barked, his tone unforgiving. "We'll sort this out later, but for now, you are no longer on duty. You failed the system, you failed the department, and most importantly, you failed that man." Bradley opened his mouth to protest, but nothing came out. He was numb, his body moving on autopilot, knowing full well that there was no excuse for what he had done. The ambulance doors opened, and James was carefully loaded onto the stretcher, his face pale but his eyes still focused, still determined. Despite the agony of the bullet lodged in his leg, he knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. "Make sure this is investigated properly," James said, his voice low but clear. He turned his gaze to the mayor and police chief. "I want him held accountable. No one should have the power to abuse others like this." Harrison nodded solemnly. "We'll make sure of it, James. You have my word." As the paramedics rushed to stabilize James and transport him to the hospital, Johnson stood frozen, his body tense with anxiety. The reality of the situation was unfolding rapidly around him, and his mind was racing. He had made a life-altering mistake. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Meanwhile, the mayor and the police chief exchanged a brief look. They both knew that this incident would be a turning point, not just for the department, but for the entire city. The shooting of a federal agent by one of their own was a public relations nightmare. But beyond that, it was a stark reminder of the racial tensions that still simmered beneath the surface of society. "This isn't just about James," Mayor Harrison said, his voice growing firmer as he spoke. "This is about a system that's broken. We need to fix this. We need to make sure this doesn't happen again." "That's what we'll do," Cole agreed, his voice unwavering. "But it starts with accountability, and it starts with making sure that officer answers for his actions." In the weeks that followed, the fallout from Officer Bradley Johnson's actions was felt across the country. The incident had sparked national outrage. Protests, debates, and discussions filled the media. People demanded justice, not just for James, but for all those who had been affected by racial prejudice in law enforcement. James, despite his pain, was at the center of it all. His injury had been severe, but he was determined to heal, not just physically, but emotionally too. What had happened that night felt like a betrayal, not just by one officer, but by an entire system that had allowed such actions to go unchecked for far too long. Meanwhile, the investigation into Officer Johnson's conduct was swift. Dashcam footage from his patrol car and witness statements painted a clear picture. There was no justification for the violence. Bradley Johnson had acted out of personal bias, abusing his authority without cause. When the case went to court, the atmosphere was tense. People were divided. Some believed Johnson's actions were an anomaly, a product of a broken system. Others felt that he was just one example of deeper issues within the police force. In the end, the judge's verdict was swift and harsh. Johnson was sentenced to 14 years in prison for abuse of power, improper use of a weapon, and racial discrimination. Outside the courthouse, the reactions were mixed. Some cheered, seeing the sentencing as a step toward justice. Others remained somber, recognizing that the work wasn't done, that this was just one incident in a much larger issue. But for James, it was a significant moment. He had been a part of something bigger than himself. Months passed. As James recovered, both physically and emotionally, he began receiving letters. Most were filled with support and encouragement, but one in particular stood out, a letter from Bradley Johnson himself. "Mr. Carter, I can never undo what I did to you. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. My time in prison has given me time to reflect, and I know now that I allowed my own prejudices to control my actions. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make amends for what I've done. I hope in time you can find it in yourself to forgive me. Bradley Johnson." James read the letter slowly. He didn't know how to feel. Could a man who had done something so terrible really change? But deep down, he knew that people could grow, and they could learn from their mistakes. Maybe Bradley Johnson could. It wasn't about forgiveness right away. It was about acknowledging the possibility of change. James had always believed in the power of redemption. Maybe this was his opportunity to see that, even for someone who had wronged him so deeply. In the months that followed, the city underwent significant reforms. The police force, shaken by the scandal, worked closely with experts to implement training programs aimed at reducing racial prejudice and improving community relations. Mayor Samuel Harrison and Chief Henry Morgan took the lead, ensuring that the changes were both visible and meaningful. James became a voice for reform, attending seminars and speaking publicly about the importance of fairness, equality, and transparency in law enforcement. His story resonated with many, inspiring action, not just in his city, but across the country. A few months later, James received another letter from Bradley. This time it was longer. Bradley spoke of the work he was doing in prison to confront his prejudices and change his ways. "Mr. Carter, I've been doing the hard work, therapy, reading, reflecting. I'll never be able to fix what I've done, but I'm trying. I hope one day I can help others understand what I failed to see before." Bradley Johnson. James sat quietly reflecting on the letter. The road to forgiveness wasn't simple, but he knew that sometimes people who've made the worst mistakes can still find a way to make things right. James' journey didn't end with Bradley Johnson's punishment. It had just begun. His fight for justice, fairness, and reform continued. For James, the true victory wasn't in seeing one man punished, but in knowing that every step forward, no matter how small, was a step toward a better future.